The US dollar feels ordinary. It sits in wallets, prices groceries, settles invoices, and disappears into screens with a tap. Yet behind that familiarity lies a contradiction. Nations depend on the dollar to function, while simultaneously preparing for the damage it can inflict. Something used by everyone is also something carefully feared. This is the paradox at the center of modern power. The dollar is presented as neutral money, a technical tool of trade and accounting, but in practice it behaves less like cash and more like terrain. Control the terrain, and you shape movement without firing a shot. The strange part is how little this transformation was announced. No treaty declared the dollar a weapon. No speech warned the world that money itself was changing. Instead, the shift happened through routine. Payment systems standardized, banks aligned, compliance rules hardened. What felt like efficiency slowly became leverage, and what felt like participation quietly became exposure. Because the process was gradual, it escaped emotional resistance. People rarely fear systems that make life easier, but power often hides inside convenience, and influence works best when it looks optional. To understand how a currency became an instrument of pressure without ever looking like one, we first need to understand how the dollar became unavoidable. That story begins with dependence, trust, scale, habit. The dollar did not conquer the world by force. It spread the way infrastructure spreads, quietly, after crisis, by solving problems others could not. After the Bretton Woods system, the dollar became the anchor of a shattered global economy, not because nations were compelled to obey, but because they needed something stable to rebuild around. The popular story says America was simply too powerful to resist. But power alone does not create universal adoption. What mattered was friction. The dollar offered deep liquidity, predictable rules, and a financial system large enough to absorb shocks. For countries rebuilding trade, borrowing to grow, or stabilizing currencies, using the dollar was easier than inventing alternatives. Invoices were priced in dollars because suppliers preferred certainty. Reserves were held in dollars because markets trusted convertibility. Debt was issued in dollars because lenders demanded reliability. Each choice was rational on its own. Together, they synchronized the global economy around a single unit of account. This was not coercion. It was convenience compounding into dependence. As more trade settled in dollars, exiting became costly, not impossible, but uncomfortable enough to delay. Over time, the dollar stopped being just money. It became infrastructure. And once a currency becomes infrastructure, influence no longer requires persuasion. It requires control over access. That shift would later define global finance, power, leverage, conflict. The real switch in global finance is not money you can see. It is the machinery you never touch. Banknotes circulate at the surface, but power sits deeper, inside settlement rails, correspondent banking, and messaging networks like SWIFT that quietly decide whose transactions move and whose do not. Most people watch prices, exchange rates, inflation prints. These are the visible signals. But beneath them runs an invisible layer of approvals, compliance checks, clearing windows, and counterparty trust. A trade can be legal, demanded, even urgent, and still fail if it cannot clear. This is where modern power concentrates. Control the rules of settlement, and you do not need to ban trade outright. You simply decide which transactions are smooth, delayed, costly, or impossible. Participation becomes conditional, not prohibited. Banks learn this quickly. Firms learn it faster. Once payments stall, insurance withdraws, credit lines tighten, and risk managers intervene. The economy slows without a single official order being issued. This architecture matters because it looks technical, not political. Yet rules embedded in systems shape behavior more effectively than speeches ever could. Infrastructure governs quietly, impersonally, and at scale. This is why influence now travels through permissions, timestamps, and compliance flags rather than borders, uniforms, or declarations of force issued by states with little public visibility or debate at all. And when control over that infrastructure begins to reflect political priorities, something fundamental changes. Financial plumbing stops being neutral. It becomes leverage. Sanctions once meant tariffs, embargoes, ships turned away at ports. They were blunt, visible, and slow, giving targets time to adapt. Modern sanctions work differently. They operate through finance, where speed matters and visibility cuts deeper than force. When countries like Iran were sanctioned in the past, trade shrank, but systems bent. Middlemen emerged, payments rerouted, pressure accumulated, but it leaked. What changed was not intent, but method. Financial sanctions moved upstream, targeting banks, clearing, insurance, and settlement itself. In the case of Russia, the shift became unmistakable. Access to reserves was frozen. Major institutions were cut from global payment networks. The punishment was not delivered through bombs or blockades, but through screens going dark. Contracts stalled. Trust evaporated. Counterparties vanished overnight. This is the emotional core of modern sanctions. A country is not invaded. It is disconnected. Its economy continues to exist, but outside the system that allows it to function normally. The shock is immediate, reputational, and difficult to reverse. The effectiveness of this tool made it irresistible to policymakers facing pressure to act without war. But each use teaches observers a lesson. Access can be withdrawn, rules can change, safety is conditional. And once that lesson spreads, behavior shifts quietly, cautiously, long before confrontation ever arrives. In finance, anticipation often matters more than punishment itself does today. Weaponizing the dollar changes how it is seen. What once felt like neutral infrastructure begins to look like conditional permission. The currency still works, but trust subtly recalibrates, not collapsing, just narrowing. From America's perspective, the leverage is powerful. Financial pressure can be applied quickly, precisely, without deploying troops or enduring long conflicts. But credibility operates on a different timeline. Each action answers an immediate problem while raising a longer question: who decides the rules tomorrow? For most countries, the response is not rebellion. It is insurance. Reserves are diversified incrementally. Trade is settled locally where possible. Bilateral agreements multiply. Alternative payment rails are explored, not to replace the dollar, but to reduce exposure. None of this looks dramatic. There are no exits, no declarations, no collapse. The system continues to function, which is precisely why the shift is easy to miss. Hedging does not announce itself. This is the hidden cost of financial weaponization. Influence remains strong, but trust becomes thinner. And when trust thins, dependence stops feeling safe, even when it remains convenient. Over time, that discomfort reshapes behavior, quietly rewriting incentives beneath the surface of global finance without headlines, alarms, or sudden breaks in the system today. The idea that the world is abandoning the dollar makes for dramatic headlines. Each new agreement, reserve shift, or alternative payment experiment is framed as evidence of collapse. But this story confuses movement with exit. The dollar's dominance rests on scale, liquidity, and legal depth. Markets trust contracts because enforcement is predictable. Capital flows because it can enter and exit without distortion. No rival system currently matches that combination at global volume. This does not mean dissatisfaction is absent. It means replacement is expensive. Financial systems reward familiarity, not ideology. Banks price risk based on history. Corporations plan around infrastructure that already works. Switching costs accumulate quietly, discouraging sudden change. What is often called de-dollarization is better understood as risk management. Countries are not rejecting the dollar, they are limiting exposure. They diversify reserves, settle some trade locally, and explore parallel rails as insurance, not revolt. The system adapts without collapsing. Power diffuses without disappearing. And the dollar remains central, not because it is loved, but because leaving it entirely would cost more than staying. This reframing matters because it reveals how modern power persists through inertia, not loyalty. That persistence explains why predictions of sudden collapse repeatedly fail, despite visible stress and growing political discomfort worldwide over time alone. Modern power rarely announces itself. It shapes the menu of choices, then steps back and lets others decide. In today's system, influence is exercised less through commands and more through constraints that feel technical, optional, even reasonable. Traditional power was visible. Armies crossed borders. Flags changed. Costs were immediate and undeniable. Financial power works differently. It does not force compliance. It narrows alternatives. You are free to act, but only inside rails designed by someone else. That is what makes money such a quiet battlefield. Payments clear or stall. Credit expands or contracts. Risk premiums rise. None of it looks like coercion, yet outcomes change all the same. The pressure is indirect but persistent. The most effective control systems are the ones people forget they are inside. When rules feel like neutral plumbing, resistance feels irrational. Adaptation feels voluntary. Dependence feels normal. This is why modern power often feels invisible. It operates through incentives rather than threats, through access rather than orders. And because it rarely breaks things outright, it attracts little outrage. The unsettling question is not whether this kind of power exists. It is whether a system built on quiet pressure can be used repeatedly, without consequence forever. The story of the dollar is not a tale of collapse or conspiracy. It is a story of indispensability. The dollar became powerful because the world organized itself around it, and that success made it tempting to use as leverage. But weaponization tests the very foundation that created strength. Trust is not binary. It erodes gradually. Each use of financial pressure solves a short-term problem while quietly reminding others that access is conditional. This does not mean the system is about to fail. It means it is changing. The dollar remains central because alternatives are costly and incomplete, not because dependence feels comfortable. That distinction matters. History suggests systems rarely end with drama. They adapt, layer, and evolve. New rails emerge alongside old ones. Habits shift before structures do. Power diffuses without disappearing. The question facing global finance is not whether the dollar will vanish, but how this balance holds. Can a currency remain indispensable while being used as a tool of pressure? Or does repeated use slowly rewrite incentives beneath the surface? Quiet change often defines history far more.